add my voice to say congratulations, all of you. But listening to you, it does seem to me that you need a little bit of training on the distinction between reform, rehabilitation, and reintegration. So let me see, I don't know how much I can do in 8 minutes, but let me see if I can do that. So the concept of reformation talks about the individual. Working with that individual to change the individual, the thought processes of the individual, including identification of any physical, psychological, biological things pertaining to that individual. So it is in the place of reformation that you can begin to identify that when you say this person is not in worship. Any offender you are discussing with and the person has not yet had insights of their role in that crime, insights of their role in bringing themselves from that pattern of life. Are you understanding me? So remember that reform is about the person. And when you look at the reform, one of the very fastest way of addressing this issue is, remember, thought processes and attitude. You find out that when you look at spiritual, programs, spiritual programs are very good in engaging people's thought processes. Remember the ACG when he was talking, he was in the ACG, he was saying something about somebody said, they say Christ had arrested me. That's exactly what that means. Christ had arrested me is at the place of the person. And I will tell you, if you have not been able to deal with this is what psychologists call the cognitive behavioral therapy. A lot of focus is on cognitive behavioral therapy. In psychology, and I will tell you, it's not just that it's only psychology, but psychologists do very well here. There are different schools of thought. One school will tell you that you need to look at the cognition, to look at the values, the attitudes, and then try to alter that thought. Cognition is about thought process. Whereas the school of thought that talks about analysis, psychoanalysis, will tell you that it is something about what is happening in the person's subconscious. So you want to be able to get to a position where subconsciously you would want to know what has the person done in their life growing up. What are those things in their growing up that is affecting their behavior now? So to make it less technical, just understand that when you talk about reform, it's talking about an individualized program that relates to the person, critically looking at what they know, what they think about crime, and how they think their role in that crime, what happened, and going forward. Do you get me? But if the person is still very angry about the society, if the person feels, that, I am right, well, and you will know, 2 minutes you will know. When you discuss with them, if I'm an inmate is there and I discuss, within the first 2 sentences, I will know where you are. I will know the position you are. So that you are in that position does not mean you cannot work with that person to get the person to shift to a position that will enable other levels of intervention. Hear me, if this first level of intervention is not effectively engaged with, every other thing you are doing can be going to be successful.
We have quite a number of activities that we spelled out. We have what we call the counseling. Now the counseling is at the point we know the need of the inmates, we begin to counsel them spiritually or based on morality and the reason why they need to embrace the program. Now as we also have literacy and numeracy competition. It's very important. We notice that when there is a competition, health competition within individual, that helps us to, it pushes our drive to carry out activities.
Exactly. So reform is about the person. Now we talk about the issue of rehabilitation. Rehabilitation now begins to look at what are the various things that this person requires to make that journey easier. Rehabilitation, you are looking at some of the programs you need to do within the time the person is within the hospital. So, for example, you need the person to go to school, school programs. It's not about thought process, it's a question of building different skills that will help the person make it easier. Vocational workshops, are you understanding? So again, as regarding rehabilitation, it's about the person and the things that will help, especially when you have identified the areas of needs and risk. So when you talk about what happens in terms of at the admission board enables you to see the factors to give you the entry point to anchor your rehabilitation program. Are you understanding what I'm saying? Is that clear? So all of that open university programs, workshops and all of that are different rehabilitation programs. So, and the key thing is not just to do rehabilitation programs, but to find out what are the marketability of that rehabilitation program. So the rehabilitation program you are giving to the person, to what extent does it align with the person's interest, the person's ability, the person's trajectory? You know, because there's some things you are doing they are not helpful. Now, I don't know whether you've noticed that a lot of workshops, especially workshops that take a long time to learn, that inmates don't, they're not very interested in it. Wedding, most of those workshops you have, they're not interested. Wedding, workshop. So, you know, things that will take them time. Don't forget that a high number of those people are waiting trial. Though we know that they end up staying long there, but many of them, at the time they are going, they are believing in their mind they are going to go into the next moment. So if you are trying to get them to get to be in workshops that has trajectory of low line, high duration, internally they will switch off, but you will not know. So when you build incentives, just like those incentives that you see in the Act, now in the Act has said, which you have not also started in planning, the Act tells you that there are 3 ways to share the profit. Because anything you are doing, if there's money in it, they will be interested. The Act says to share this money into 3. And why did we talk about this? Because before the Act, people were still, the workshops, they were still doing it and were stealing the money. So now you are having a very structured, rather than say all the money is sent to Abuja, you are saying that some part of the money should be put as a business to run that project. Another part of the money should be returned to Abuja. Another one should go to the inmates. If you do it well, it will help. But during the COVID, for example, Plaza supported the production of 50,000 face masks. And I'm asking, I said, I want to know how much of the profit came to me. I want to see it. Because if it is incentive, then you see that a lot of them want to put, especially if they're getting small money. So again, whatever program you have, it doesn't matter what that thing is. Make sure there is a way some money comes to you. Especially maybe money that is calculated on the basis of how they come to the workshop, how many times you make attendance. So when you are sharing the profit, if it's time to the attendance, next time you see them coming to the workshop, you are welfare officers, so it does not concern you, but you can engage with workshop officers and discuss with them, okay? Is it clear what rehabilitation is? Yes. Now the final bit, which is the reintegration, just like some of you were already doing it. So you're thinking of what will happen when the person is outside. What are the things that are required to happen to make sure that reintegration is helpful? Somebody said that some people talked about recruitment, job, employment, dealing with the families, all of that falls within reintegration. So there is a very thin line. So in reality, these things do not sit as silos. There is a very small thin line connecting all of them. So as a matter of fact, what we are doing at the level of information has a way of connecting with what happens at rehabilitation through the part of integration. And integration is not, you finish, no problem. It's a continuous effort, even while the person is there, because anything can happen and it will lapse. So in terms of what they do and how they engage with their family is a part of integration. The family have been away for a very long time from the inmates. No, the actual adaptation is also an issue. So these are things we need to look at and find a way to deal with it. So again, I believe to some extent, it's very clear this little distinction and is important. Now, in terms of faith-based, you must understand that faith-based organizations are not there as government, just like civil society organizations. Okay, the broad term is civil society organizations, yeah? And within civil society organizations, then you have the faith-based organizations, you have the NGOs, you have grassroots organizations, and all the rest of them. The strength of faith-based and over all the others is when we are talking about something that is to do with the concept of morality and faith. You know, so the greatest strength of faith-based is where you see the remnant of reformation. At that point, the attitude, the thinking, you don't have to bring God to them, the concept of God, which you will not begin to see with others. The other thing is that with faith-based organization, because it's easy, you know, most of the NGOs and the grants, things are made in terms of the grants and what they have available. But with faith-based, you go to a church, you go to a mosque, all of the skills and things you need, those people are there. that can be applied somewhere. But at the end of the day, the government institutions, in this case ELCOS, must bear in mind to integrate many of these things on its own so that it will have a life of its own. It is only when you have a life of its own that it can drive far and far. Okay? I also want to say finally that there is a connection. What you will need to be doing when you are there, ask yourself, what is my role and how does it connect with the chief warden's office, with the health unit, with even quick warders, kitchen? Because you may find out that somebody with the workshops and notice that this inmate is nothing, it's not even eating well, or the inmate is not laughing, or people are doing sports, it's not doing sports. That should be a critical. Don't let the inmates go like that. Take notice, watch their faces. How many are participating? How many do you see all the time going to the sick bay? Why? Clinic. So these are all clues telling you things. Okay? So, and there is nothing that you can get to that you cannot find a way to. There's always activities.
We have quite a number of activities that we spelled out. We have what we call the counseling. Now the counseling is at the point we know the need of the inmates, we begin to counsel them spiritually or based on morality and find the reason why they need to embrace the program. Now as we also have literacy and numeracy competition. It's very important. We notice that when there is a competition, health competition within individual, that helps us to push our drive to carry out activities.
You may look at first of you talked about the point about assessing what your inmates are and at the level. If a lot of sorry, you can see that. If a lot of your inmates are inmates that are going to spend shorter number of time, maybe 2 weeks, maybe 1 month, you can quickly think of what can I do with these people, quick. So you took a program that will deal with that. So it depends on the group you are dealing with. And your inmate mainly educated, you know what you need to do. Depends on their needs. Somebody was presenting, I think it's the second group that presented, I talked about going to assess who are these faith-based organizations. Yes, you need to do that. Apart from doing your mapping about and assessing the level of your organization, your inmates, you also need to do that for all the others that are coming to be of help to you. You know, you want to know what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, what are their locations. So nobody can do everything. So you now know which kind of inmate can I send to this person, which kind of thing can I ask this organization to do for you. So that way you will be better placed to deal with that. And let me also say, though that we're focusing on faith-based organization, but I need you to look at what I call the whole of society's approach. The whole of society's approach recognizes that every point is an entry point, including government agencies. Find out what are those government agencies that can be of help, depending on your needs. And build that synergy, build that connection. Look at the faith-based organization. Look at different people who can be there to help you. At the end of the day, your eye is on these 3 things. How do I reform the individual directly? How do I ensure that I provide enabling processes to ensure that this person is truly rehabilitated? And what are the steps I'm taking, both in concept and in the community, most especially, to promote proper reintegration back to them when they come out? There are certain things that is not the job of faith-based organizations, and if they do it, they just another one. So you do not expect them to be the one doing around that advocating. They can, but that's another one. The strength is how do they convert many more people in the faith platforms, in the churches, in the mosques, to recognize the importance of supporting offenders, working with ex-offenders, dealing with the issue of stigmatization, things like that. How do they encourage people to buy into the vision, to recognize the importance of supporting the correctional service? So the bulk of that is, and again, how would they be able to speak to the minds of the people, including the people who have not yet committed offenses, or those who have committed and have not been caught? There are a lot of people who have committed offenses, they have not yet been caught, and they're outside. So how do they get to that one? How will they deal with those who have committed offenses and they are there and to be able to deal with it? There's so much I could do with what I heard here, but I really do not have enough time given to me. So I just felt from your presentation that I needed to do that clear distinction. I don't know, is it clearer now? Yes. Are you sure? Yes. Are you happy?
We are supposed to have a virtual session now, and you are welcome to the session on the prisoner's journey, the study of the prisoner's journey, a panel discussion. This is a virtual session, and we'd like to welcome our panelists who are already online. I can see Mr. Matthew Anderson, Assistant Research Professor of Ethics and Theology, Institute for Studies of Religion, Baylor University, Washington. He's online. You're welcome, sir.
Belief and conduct. Excuse me, I've got a message that I can't. Okay. This is a story that has largely been told by Professor Johnson and Professor Ding and many others in the field. And the idea is basically that participation in religion helps offenders both while they are in correctional centers and after they leave avoid reoffending and the like. The second story is that religious beliefs are actually not conducive to religious responsibility taking. And there are a few ways in which this story goes. One story is which undermines responsibility. So offenders who think that God's forgiveness is automatic, think that they don't have to take responsibility for what they're doing. Another way in which this goes is that they blame God or fate for what they were doing. So it's just not up to them. They don't need to take responsibility. So these are the two stories within the literature. Our research discovered that religion is conducive to active responsibility taking, even when responsibility is situated within a narrative of forgiveness. Now, it's important to understand what we mean when we talk about active versus passive responsibility. So when we talk about passive responsibility, correctional centers, and they're held responsible for their wrongs. They're held accountable for them. But they aren't necessarily taking active responsibility for themselves. There's one criminologist, John Braithwaite, who suggests that active responsibility means take responsibility for putting something right into the future, that they have, the offender themselves has a sense that there is something that needs to be done. All right, give me just 1 second. So our study was a longitudinal evaluation, as I mentioned, of a program called the Prisoner's Journey, where we evaluated offenders' attitudes and conducts. The qualitative assessment was, as you can see there on the screen, we did a pre-interview, we did a follow-up interview, and then roughly about a year later, we came back and did a third interview in some cases. We evaluated both treatment and control prisons, and we looked at 2 different countries, Colombia and, of course, South Africa. And I'll let my boss, Dr. J, walk through some of the details of how this whole study went. You can see here are the details of the prisoner's journey. It's a Bible study led by our host, Prison Fellowship International. It's led by volunteers, and it emphasizes narratives of sin and forgiveness. As you can see, Prison Fellowship International, the way they describe it, the curriculum is designed to transform the lives of prisoners from the inside out by introducing them to a restorative relationship with the person of Jesus. So you can see we randomly selected our participants for our interviews. We had 73 inmates. Our socioeconomic data was limited by the fact that it's very hard to necessarily get countries to work with us, and so we weren't able to get all of the data for every inmate that we had wanted to receive. But in general, the 2 groups across the 2 countries were roughly the same in terms of their particular characteristics. It's important to understand, when we're thinking about religious responsibility taking, what it means that someone is religious. So how we coded the interviews, or how we assess the interviews, is really important. In general, the interviews that we did had a narrative arc to them. Offenders talked about how they ended up in prison, how their life was in prison, and what they were expecting or hoping for after prison. You can see we focused on the responsibility for how they got into prison, their attitudes about it, and so on. It's really important to note, though, that we distinguish between those who were highly religious offenders were those who not only identified as religious, but volunteered that they would attend religious practices or services on a regular basis. They used explicit religious imagery and talked about Father God or reading the Bible and so on. Offenders who were weakly religious were those that self-identified as religious, so they said they were a Christian or said that they were Muslim or the like, but they didn't talk about engaging in devotional practices on their own, or they didn't use religious imagery in their offhand answers. There are a couple of limitations to the study. We had a lot of attrition. There were a lot of people who dropped out. It's also the case that our access to offenders is very limited, and so who we interviewed was based on who completed the studies and when they completed the studies, which may mean there's a bias towards more highly educated individuals within our research. So there are 2 broad takeaways from this particular study. The first is are likely to take active responsibility for their offenses. And the second is that participating in the prisoner's journey specifically is, in some cases, able to transform people's experience of their responsibility taking. It helps them take more responsibility. I won't run through this. If Benson would like me to share this with people, I can send this via email. It's basically the statistical breakdown of how people changed, the sort of rates at which we saw people make changes in terms of their responsibility taking. The more interesting data is sort of what we found narratively. So within our control prisons, so these are prisons where there is no prisoners, offenders are very capable of accepting blame, but identifying mitigating factors for their wrongs. So you can see that this offender says that they're very conscious that they have done something bad, but he's able to recognize that it was because of poverty and his family's financial situation that he agreed to do the things that brought him here. So on the one hand, he takes full responsibility for his wrong. On the other hand, he recognizes that there are social causes that led him to the place where he is, which is a very fine-grained account of responsibility. It's in certain ways a better account of responsibility than one that doesn't include social causes, because it's taking responsibility only for what he actually did, and not necessarily for things that he's not in control of. And we saw this across every offender, very subtle accounts of responsibility. What we saw in prisons without the prisoner's journey is that weakly religious offenders accepted blame, but also attribute their wrongs to fate or deaths. So this particular offender, you can see, they eventually say, God must have wanted it that way. I believe in one God. I was not a member of a religion when I was on the outside. I didn't go to church, but I do believe in God. I guess it was my destiny. And this is in response to a question about how they ended up in prison. It was there. And so those who are highly religious seem to be able to re-narrate or reinterpret their experience of prison in such a way that it's better for them to be there than it was for them to be on the streets. A lot of times that's because they will say, as this offender does, they might on the streets. And so it's better to be in prison than to be dead on the streets. But they also will say that being in prison gives them an opportunity to engage in religious practices, to read the Bible, to learn, to grow, and that they have opportunities in prison to grow spiritually that they feel like they did not have on the streets. So one big takeaway from the control prisons is that religious practices seem to be compatible with responsibility taking, that even highly religious offenders are able to take responsibility, and weakly religious offenders will be actually more likely to blame destiny or fate for how they ended up in prison. But what about the treatment prison, those prisons where the prisoner's journey is active and present? What we see in these cases, actually, just give me 1 second, I'm going to there we are. So what we see in these cases is that participation in the prisoner's journey in some offenders, active responsibility taking. So here, you can see that in one interview, this is someone who went through the prisoner's journey. The first interview, the offender stated that the cause of their crime was sin, but sin in a very general way. Right? And so we asked them how he ended up in prison, and whether it was his fault or the fault of someone else. And this offender said it's the same. None of us are innocent. We all make mistakes. It's like a sin. A sin could be very small or very big, but the word is sin, no sin. Right? It's a very generalized account of sin and his own responsibility. There's no sense in which he's uniquely or specially responsible. The second interview that we did with him changed in two ways his answer to this. He owned that he was angry about those who had put him in prison. He describes them as arrogant, very arrogant. And he says, but I also know that I made a mistake, and these are the consequences for my mistake. No, I don't feel anger because it's my own doing. And he talks about how God has healed that part of him. There's a sense in which he's not just blaming generalized account of sin and how it's all the sin. He's got a much more specific answer about who, namely his own. And we saw this repeated in several of the interviews where offenders were likely to generalized accounts of responsibilities, but to say, I was the one who did wrong, and that's why I ended up in prison. The second thing that we saw is that he'll not come back into prison, which in certain respects seems weird to think of that as a good thing, but I actually think it is a good thing. Because he's more attentive to the sorts of dangers and challenges that he'll have on the outside and probably more likely to prepare for them. The third thing that we saw was participation in the prisoner's journey compelled offenders to in minor ways. So, this third view, we received, we were able first we were able to do 3 interviews with. The first one, they denied tried to meet the agencies that he could by stopping drinking, by stopping smoking, and many of the offenders who went through the prisoner's journey engaged in those sorts of practices. They tried to clean up their minor vices, as it were, in order to strengthen their wills and to show that they were taking responsibility for their lives, even while they couldn't enact much agency because they were in prison. So our takeaways from this side of the study is that participation in the prison journey can increase for some offenders responsibility taking. And we've got a couple of hypotheses or guesses as to why this is. One thought is that the prisoner's journey emphasizes personal wrongdoing, but it also does recognize within its curriculum the social causes of crime. Within its own sort of story that it tells offenders, it helps offenders acknowledge that there are many reasons why they ended up in prison, but that those reasons cannot remove their own responsibility, their own sense of blame for what they did. The second explanation that we have is that the prisoner's journey provides offenders with models of active responsibility taking. So if there are DVDs available, offenders will watch videos where they see ex-offenders, those who have been released from prison, talk about their own responsibility for their wrongs, and how they ended up being able to find forgiveness. And that gives offenders a model for how they can interpret their own lives. The third explanation that we have, or hypothesis that we have, is that the prisoner's journey allows offenders to share openly about their past wrongs with each other. So offenders get together and they talk about how they ended up in prison, and this provides a way in which they are able to take responsibility for their lives accordingly. So that's what I have. Here's a number of academic references if you're interested. We're very grateful, as we said, for your time and attention. We look forward to your questions when they come, but otherwise I'm happy to hand it off to my colleague, Dr. Vignette.
quantitative aspect of our research, and my colleague Dr. Anderson has just finished the qualitative side based on personal interviews. And the presentation that I'm going to make focuses on quantitative data. And obviously, this project was intended to the impact of the prisoner's journey, Prison Fellowship International on prisoner rehabilitation. The project began in January 2018, and 2 countries were selected, Colombia and South Africa, because these 2 countries were the countries where the TPJ, the Prisoner's Journey program, had been running for longer than in other countries. And data collection using the method of survey as well as interview, which again Dr. Anderson has just talked about, began in February 2018 and continued through November 2019. And our research
recording in progress.
And our research design was a quasi-experimental study. So we conducted experiment, creating 2 groups. Experimental group, which includes the inmates who participated and completed TPJ program. And the other group is control group, which consists of inmates who did not participate in the program. It is a quasi-experimental study because random assignment, randomly assigning inmates to these 2 groups was not possible. So, but still, our research design was experimental study. Data collection was conducted 3 times over this about 21-month research period. The first data collection was called the pre-test survey, conducted before TPJ program began. And the second data collection was post-test, right after TPJ was completed and graduated from the program. And the third data collection, which we call follow-up survey and interviews, were conducted several months to a year after the post-test. Now, in Colombia, we selected 2 prisons, both of which were male prisons. The prison in Medellin, as you can see in the map, called the Bella Vista Prison, where TPJ program had been running for years. So we selected this prison and we created our experimental group, or TPJ group. On the other hand, we also found another prison, relatively close to Medellin, in Puerto Triunfo prison, where TPJ was not made available. So we created a sample of inmates who did not participate in the program. In South Africa, we conducted research in 6 prisons, 4 male prisons and 2 female prisons, and TPJ and control group inmates were selected from 3 prisons each, 2 male prisons and 1 female prisons. On this map shows the location or the provinces where our research was conducted. 2 provinces, Gauteng province and Free State, and that's where we conducted our research in South Africa. Now this table shows the number of inmates who participated, each survey, pre-test, post-test, and follow-up survey. And let me draw your attention to the last column, which is the total column. And in Colombia, the 424 inmates were participating in the pre-test survey. And then 255 out of 424 came back to participate in the second survey, post-test survey. And then probably because of relatively long time interval during which transfer and release and various changes took place, and so a rather small number of inmates who participate in the pretest came back to complete the third survey. A similar pattern you can observe in South Africa. We began with 437 inmates, and then 251 of them came back to participate in a second survey, and then rather a substantially reduced number of inmates came for the last third survey. So combining these two numbers, these two countries, and the pretest sample was 861, and a number of inmates who participated in the second survey was 506, and then the follow-up surveys were completed by 121. Because of rather a substantial attrition between post-test and follow-up survey, the presentation that I'm making is based upon the first two surveys, that is pre-test and the post-test survey. As Dr. Anderson has already mentioned, the Prisoner's Journey is a Prison Fellowship International signature program administered in many countries, and 650 prisons plus and 40 plus countries, including Nigeria. It's a Bible study covering the Gospel of Mark in 8 two-hour sessions. So originally designed to cover over 8-week period, but depending on the situation, it can be longer. And facilitated by volunteers from outside local churches or inmates who were trained to lead the curriculum. Again, Dr. Anderson mentioned this curriculum's main purpose and goal, which is to transforming the lives of prisoners from the inside out by introducing a restorative relationship with the person Jesus. Translating this curriculum's main goal is prisoner rehabilitation. So in other words, the TPJ intends to help those prisoners change themselves. And in terms of change, we focused on 3 specific aspects of changes to measure the prisoner rehabilitation. Positive changes in self-identity, that is whether identity transformation took place, or and the existential belief, a sense of meaning and purpose in life, from no meaning and purpose in life to a new sense of meaning and purpose, and we consider that as a positive change, which is a part of prisoner rehabilitation. And finally, the character change, that is the virtuous characteristics. Now this diagram summarizes 3 key questions that we ask in this study. The first question is, since TPJ is a faith-based program and in design to achieve the goal of transforming inmates through the relationship with Jesus or religious activities. So our first question and hypothesis was, participating in TPJ is expected to increase religious involvement, the participation in religion. And religiosity was measured in various ways, and subjectively and objectively, which I will explain a bit more detail later. So that was the first question. Does TPJ increase inmate participation in religious activities? Second question is, if TPJ increased religiosity, does increased religiosity contribute to prisoner rehabilitation? And again, we measured specifically the prisoner rehabilitation in 3 ways: identity transformation, and the sense of meaning and purpose in life, and virtue development. Now finally, and the third question is, if there was a prisoner rehabilitation as a result of participating in TPJ, did it help address some of the key issues among prison inmates? So to answer that question, we looked at two aspects or two types of main problems among prison inmates. The first one was negative emotional states, which is very common problems among prisoners. And the other is, of course, the behavioral problems. So we measure the risk or probability or likelihood of interpersonal aggression toward another inmate. So these are the research questions, and we are going to start with the first question. Does TPJ increase religiosity? Now, even though we have conducted a very complicated multivariate model, meaning that instead of just looking at religiosity and program participation, we control for or haven't taken consideration all potential sources of influence, confounding effects, but instead of showing the complicated the table with a lot of numbers, and I think sharing this graph is kind of well presents and summarizes what we have found. Now this graph will show the change in religiosity, meaning the religious participation, before TPJ, which was measured by pre-test survey, and then post-test. And this is the change that we observed among inmates who participated and completed TPJ. So in other words, the religiosity level was 0.629 before they participated in TPJ. After completing TPJ, the religiosity increased to 0.761. About roughly 21% increase. Now this religiosity, again, measured in both objective and subjective ways. So we measure the frequency of attending religious worship services and the frequency of reading the Bible and other sacred texts alone, outside of worship service. And also we measure the frequency of prayer in private. So praying alone, how often they pray. And also we measure their subjective perceptual, how close they felt to God, and also how important religion or relation with God was for them. As you can see here, somewhat interestingly, among those inmates who did not participate in TPJ, the initial level of religiosity over time declined during that observation period. So basically, this picture shows what we found regarding the first question. Does TPJ increase religiosity? And our answer, based on the data that we shared and we analyzed, is yes. TPJ participation statistically significantly increased religious involvement, as we expected. Now, moving to the second question. Now, if TPJ increased religiosity, did the TPJ increase religiosity contribute to prisoner rehabilitation? Again, we measure rehabilitation in three specific ways. The first thing was whether a self-identity change, because TPJ intends to change and transform a prisoner from inside out. So we are not just looking at external changes, but internal changes we observed as well. So identity transformation measured focusing on three dimensions: cognitive identity change and emotional identity change. And another concept that we used is called the crystallization of discontent. And this is basically a measure of a motivation for self-change. And obviously, in order for an inmate to change, he or she needs to be motivated to change. So one of the question was whether TPJ motivated those TPJ participating inmates to change themselves, even if we could not observe the actual change, but we also wanted to measure and observe whether there was a change in the motivation for self-change. The second indicator of rehabilitation was a sense of meaning and purpose in life. And third, development of the virtues. Dr. Anderson talked about responsibility. So we observed that particular virtuous characteristic, not only qualitatively but also quantitatively as well. And besides responsibility, we also measured forgiveness and self-control. So, as I said earlier, TPJ participation increased religiosity. And the second question that we are asking is, does increased religiosity contribute to prisoner rehabilitation, identity transformation, sense of meaning and purpose, and moral character virtues? In our multivariate analysis, and again quantitative analysis, show evidence of the rehabilitative effect of religiosity. Specifically, we found TPJ increased religiosity, increased crystallization of discontent. Again, this measures motivation for self-change. So even though we did not find significant cognitive and emotional identity change, but we observe a significant, statistically significant increase in the motivation for self-change. So increased religiosity, increased motivation for self-change among those program participating inmates. Increased religiosity also increased the sense of meaning and purpose in life. And as you can imagine, many prisoners must have no sense of meaning after what they have done and where they are. But we captured a statistically significant increase in a sense of meaning and purpose. So they reported that their life has meaning, and also the sense of purpose, that is the life goal. And part of the reason is because the God's plan for their lives. And finally, we also found statistically significant increase in virtuous characteristics, forgiveness and responsibility or accountability and self-control. And again, this was a longitudinal study, so this is not just a correlation, but rather change between pre-test and post-test, indicating a causal influence of TPJ program upon these indicators of rehabilitation through or by increasing religious involvement or participation. Let me take you to the last question, that is, okay, we have found TPJ increased religious involvement among inmates, and that increased religiosity contributed to rehabilitation, positive changes among those inmates. And the last question concerns if there were positive changes, did those changes make changes or address some of the problems common among prisoners, emotional problems? That is, to measure emotional problems, we measure in terms of negative emotions, such as feelings of depression and anxiety and anger. And for behavioral issues, we used a method called the Vignette Method. So basically, Vignette is a scenario, hypothetical situation where a main character, in this case Miguel, the name which we used for the Colombian survey, and in South Africa, we replaced it as Michael. So here the main character, Michael, in a certain situation got into a argumentation with another prison inmate, and then eventually he got into an argument with another inmate called David, yelling and screaming. So we gave this scenario, and then we asked the survey participating inmates, how likely is it that you will do the same as Michael? Giving 7 different levels of likelihood as an option, from 0, not likely at all, 0%, I will do the same, which Michael did to David, and all the way to certainly 100%. Now, the likelihood interpersonal aggression, and we looked at the pretest, and slightly more than 1/3 said it's not likely at all. That means I will not do the same thing that Michael did to David. But as you can see here, not everyone says I'm not going to do it, but rather about 1/3 of the sample said it's likely, or including about 14% who said 100% certainly, and I will do exactly what Michael did. So, and I'm showing this distribution because this shows that there was a decent and reasonable variation in their responses. In other words, not everyone said I'm not going to do it to look good. So, which allowed us to conduct the next set of research. So, the question again is whether prisoner rehabilitation reduced negative emotions among inmates and reduced the risk of interpersonal aggression, the likelihood. And our research showed that a sense of meaning and purpose increased the sense of meaning and purpose, decreased negative emotional state, again, depression, anxiety, and anger. When we looked at those increased virtuous characteristics, decreased both emotional problems and also the likelihood of behavioral problems, in this case, interpersonal aggression. Increased motivation for self-change was found to decrease interpersonal aggression, the risk of interpersonal aggression, even though this significant decrease was observed among Colombian prisoners. And we speculated that the reason why we did not find the same reduction, reducing impact of the crystallization of discontent on interpersonal aggression was because compared to Colombian prisoners we studied, South African prisoners who participated in TPJ were relatively religiously involved already. So because of their already relatively high levels of religious involvement, crystallization of discontent might have no significant effect on interpersonal aggression. But again, among Colombian prisoners, we found that the religion increased motivation for self-change, decreased the likelihood or the risk of interpersonal aggression. In addition to that, we also found, even though it did not, TPJ did not have an impact through religiosity, but TPJ participation also increased the emotional transformation, which in turn decreased the negative emotional state as well. Let me summarize and conclude. So in sum, the TPJ significantly increased religious involvement among prisoners as we anticipated. Not much surprise here because TPJ is a faith-based program and intended to help prisoners change through religious activities, through the relationship with God. And the TPJ increased religiosity, motivated self-change, and gave a sense of meaning and purpose in life, and fostered virtues. All of this, in turn, enhanced emotional well-being by reducing negative emotional states, and also it reduced the risk, that is, probability of interpersonal aggression among prisoners. So TPJ, we found, tends to rehabilitate prisoners in terms of identity, existential belief and character, and thereby having prisons function as a truly correctional institution. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Sue and Jim, for a great presentation. Benson, I hope that you can all still hear us. And we are not only thrilled at the results of the research, we are now publishing this research in multiple journals here in the U.S. and continue to work on publications. And one of the last things that I would like to add to these two outstanding presentations is that we had a few other people that were working with us on this project that couldn't be on this call. Michael Joseph from Mexico, as well as Karen Williams from South Africa, co-authors and co-researchers with us. We want to thank them, and of course, Prison Fellowship International supported the work. One of the beautiful things about what you've heard today is that the research that we've conducted in Africa is consistent with the research that we've been conducting here in the United States over the last number of years. That's one of the questions that people ask. Are studies in the West relevant for studies outside of the West? And we're excited to say that they're very consistent. And so this bodes well for the role that religion plays around the world, not just here, not just there in Africa, but in other parts of the world. It shows that there's hope, that we can do things within the correctional system that actually are helpful to people. And so just framing this research in the context of other research with offenders in completely different prisons, in completely different parts of the world, but yet with largely the same effect, is something that we're excited about and encouraged. We hope that you are as well. And maybe we'll throw it back to you all now. I'm not sure, but I think if we're ready for a question and answer session for the next few minutes. And hopefully someone from your end can facilitate that. We look forward to answering any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Brian.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Yeah, good afternoon, Professor Akim Bello.
Good afternoon.
Yes, you're welcome.
Yes, my name is Akim Bello. I'm from Lagos, Nigeria, and of the Faculty of Religiosity of Lagos. I want to thank you all for the wonderful presentations. And I mean, you have indeed shown the potentials of TPJ to positively influence the inmates. Now, I was just wondering, did you observe, we are all familiar with the general conditions of prisons all over the world. The conditions may be better from one location to another. But is there any impact that general prison conditions in terms of conduciveness, in terms of an available space to meet with the prisoners, played in getting them to be interested in participating in TPG?
That's a great question. And let me just make sure I've got the question correct. You're asking if the space itself in the correctional facility, knowing that all correctional facilities are not the same, does that have any bearing? And, it's an excellent question because, yes, some prisons have low security, some have high security. Some have populations that are well beyond their capacity. And so I'm going to take an initial shot at answering your question, Akeem, and then I'll let my colleagues join in. For example, we studied a prison in South America where there were what they called patios, but what other prisons might call units or the yard, different segments of a prison, all under one roof, but clearly operating differently. And so our access to prisoners on those different yards or those different patios was different. Some of them were more readily available to us. And if they were more readily available, then the prisoners could participate in the programs more easily than inmates in other sections of this very same prison. So that does have an effect. We were encouraged that even in Bella Vista, which is the prison I'm now referring to in Medellin, the results were still positive in spite of these challenges. So what does that mean? I think it means that as many obstacles that we face, because we have challenges where there's contraband and they lock a prison down, and then the movement from one part of the prison to the next part of the prison for inmates to participate in these programs or to participate in surveys that we would conduct. Some of those security issues prevent us from doing all that we hope we can accomplish. And so, yes, it's a factor, and we always anticipate that there are going to be challenges like that. We know that prisons do multiple counts during the day on the prison population. If the counts don't add up, they prevent movement there. So these are just challenges that you have to overcome, and we try to do that. Does it vary? It does vary. That too is yet another reason why the findings to us are encouraging, that in spite of all the challenges, and the fact that these prisons are different from one jurisdiction to another. It's not just that prisons in America are different than prisons in South Africa or Nigeria. Prisons within Nigeria are different than each other. So there are always those kind of unique challenges. And so if you find that something works in one location and it doesn't work in another, that doesn't mean that the program itself is flawed. But we're encouraged because in spite of all these unique differences, we still have been generating positive findings that indicate this program can be very, very helpful. So that's my long-winded answer for your question. I'm not sure if Matt or Soon Jun would like to add to that.
One thing that I can add is in South Africa, even though there were some differences in terms of degree of support, but we found that in both countries, prison administrators were supportive of faith-based programs so that the inmates can relatively freely participate in those programs such as TPJ, and especially in South Africa, the inmate participation in religious activities was a constitutionally protected right. So, and I think the policy level support was very crucial to the success operation of programs like TPJ. That's one thing that I observed.
Okay, thank you. There are one or two questions.
Covered it.
There are one or two questions from here.
King, more questions?
Yes, there
Thank you
are.
very much for the response.
Okay, Professor. All right. Please, we have one or two questions from the audience.
Benson, back to you.
Okay, I just have a quick question. Thank you very much for that research, and thanks that you were able to give us some insights into the comparison between what you got from Colombia and in South Africa. I was a little bit curious. I know that from what you said, you had two facilities, two male facilities in Colombia, and you had 3 facilities in South Africa, 2 male and 1 female. But I was just wondering, did you find any significant difference between the responses that you observed from the female respondents, the female facility that was in South Africa, vis-a-vis male respondents, whether they be in South Africa or in Colombia? Is there any gender disparity, any indication at all in whatever way?
All right, thank you.
Okay. Benson or any of the other colleagues in Nigeria to come back to the microphone. Let me just say that one of the encouraging developments with TPJ that we've been discussing with Prison Fellowship International is the possibility of expanding TPJ's footprint in additional prisons around the world. That we're encouraged about. There is ongoing discussions between our team and headquarters about extending our research as well. And so we're excited about that.
Brian, can you hear us now?
Yes, now I can hear you, Benson.
Thank you so much. The basic question Dr. Kuju asked was whether there was any discernible difference between female respondents and male respondents in your research. That fundamentally is her question.
Great.
Whether there
Great.
was any
Great.
Yeah, thanks. Go on.
Yeah, that's a great question because as many people may know, in many published studies, women tend to be more open to religion and men tend to be more religious than men in countries all around the world. This has been a finding for many, many years, and so the question then becomes, would a faith-based intervention like TPJ be more effective with women than men? I know the answer to that question, but my colleague Soon Jun actually can back it up better than I can with the numbers. So Soon Jun, I'm going to throw it over to you to shed light on the answer to that question about religion versus men.
Yeah, as just mentioned, the research has established some gender differences in religious activities and the impact of religion on life between males and females. So we were interested in examining whether the TPJ has a gender-specific influence. And making a long story short, we found no significant difference. In other words, the TPJ, or religion in general, seems to have a similar rehabilitative impact on both males and females. So that's our basic finding.
And I'll just add along with that, Benson, that we are continuing, we are now undertaking a study of women here in the U.S. In a women's prison. Women are largely understudied. Most of the studies are on men, and so we're glad that we're able to include women in this research. But we need more research to give us even better insights to that. But there too, we've been encouraged, as Sunjun just pointed out, that there's no statistical difference between men and women, meaning that the program has brought appeal.
Okay, thank you very much, Brad. Professor Akinbelo, do you have any other interventions to wrap up the session? Professor Bello, please, would you like to wrap up the session for us?
Well, I want to thank presenters from the other side of the globe, has a lot of potential. And I think we were encouraged by the findings from different parts of the world that lends credence to the potentials of TPJ in reforming offenders. And I think this provides us with a good platform to continue our own TPJ initiatives in Nigeria. And believe that as we go along, whatever challenges comes along, we will find ways of getting around it. So we want to thank all our participants from the other side of the globe, and we hope, and also those of us who are joining both physically and virtually, and we hope that when next time we meet, maybe we will probably have opportunity to share experiences concerning how TPJ is doing in Nigeria.
Well, let me just say on behalf of our team too, we look forward to...
Thank you very much, and God bless.
Thank you. God bless. We look forward to being in touch and continuing to work with you all more intentionally over time. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian Josie. Thank you, Matthew Anderson and Sun Jung Jan. Professor Akinbelo, thank you for coordinating and moderating the session. Thank you so much. We'll see you some other time. We're giving you a virtual clap now.